Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 6th of December, where I wanted to talk a little bit more about poetry. So at this point, you should have received journal number 2 back from me, where you were responding informally to dramas. And hopefully, my comments would give you an idea of how you could pursue a paper. Remember that I'm not grading for grammar or mechanics, just for content. Think of it as a kind of conversation on paper, if you will. And that our second paper is going to be due, at least according to our syllabus, this upcoming Thursday, the 8th. However, that said, I can take that paper up until the last day of class, which is the 15th of December, believe it or not. And I do have to emphasize that while I've tried to be flexible with due dates, it does end on the 15th. So at that particular point in time, you need to have submitted in everything for this particular class. And that also includes a journal number 3, which would be on 3 poems. And as you know, the journals are meant to be an informal response. So you can choose 3 poems out of the poems that we've done. And then hopefully you can actually utilize some of that for our final examination, which is an open book, open note examination. And if we were meeting in person, that would be on the 22nd, I believe. I think that's correct. And that said, it would be at 1 p.m. So what I am going to be doing is posting the exam on Thursday the 22nd at 1 p.m. And you would have 24 hours to answer that exam. If we were meeting in person, you would be doing that over a 2-hour period. So that's about as much time as you should be devoting to the final exam, approximately 2 hours or so. And since the exam is open book, open notes, you can utilize things such as your journals, which, if you remember, I will be putting some commentary on, and you're free to use that commentary as well as your journal responses when you take the final examination. That will be 40 points per poem. I'm going to ask you to choose 2 poems out of a handful I select. So that would be 80 points, and that leaves basically 20 points. 10 points for short story, 10 points for drama, just to finish off the semester. Again, an essay exam. So where we are is, however, talking about writing about and reading poetry. Though today's attendance question is going to be about paper number 2. Specifically, which play are you thinking about writing about for paper number 2 for your paper, and why? Again, paper number 2, very similar to paper number 1. The distinction being that you would be writing on drama rather than writing on short story. Approximately 4 to 5 pages in response to one of the dramas. And I selected some possible paper topics that you could pursue. That's in our syllabus and other documents folder. But certainly you can create your own topic. And that said, I can't remember if I had mentioned work to rule to you, but I just wanted you to know, and because you'll probably be hearing about it on campus, that the GCC faculty and staff been trying to negotiate a contract with the state of Massachusetts for over 16 months, and it has been unsuccessful. So faculty and staff across the state are going on work to rule, which means we are following the letter of our contract, but we aren't doing any additional work. And that said, I doubt that it would in any way impact you significantly as a student. There are quite a few things that we do as faculty and staff outside of the classroom. We often serve on committees, college governance, things of that nature. So those would be the activities that we wouldn't be engaged in. So if you hear about work to rule, I just wanted you to know a little bit about that. So going back to poetry, there's a section entitled Writing About Poetry where we have some suggestions. And these will seem very familiar because these are basically the same suggestions we've been following for writing about short story and writing about drama. Who is the speaker? And can we find out any information about the speaker? Is the speaker addressing anybody in particular? How do you respond to the speaker? Is there a specific time or place? Does reading the poem aloud help you understand it? And I would definitely say yes. Make sure that you are reading poetry out loud, because poetry is meant to be heard. And as a paraphrase, as we were talking about last class, putting it into your own language can be very helpful in terms of your initial understanding of a poem. The title, and how is that significant? Are the choices of diction or words, does that reveal meaning within the poem? And if so, what? Are there figures of speech used? Are there symbols used? And if so, how and why? Is irony used? And if so, how and why? What is the tone of the poem? Are there sounds that are repeated? Is there some sort of meter or beat or rhyme? What is the poem's overall form or structure? Does it follow an established pattern, or does it break an established pattern? And if so, why? Poetry is very intense and concentrated, as we discussed. So the question asked, do you think it's warrants more than one or two close readings? I can answer that one for you. It definitely warrants more than one or two close readings. Did you enjoy the poem? And it's okay to say that you didn't. I'm hoping for 3 lists for each of you by the ending of the semester. The poetry and literature that you enjoyed, the poetry and literature that perhaps you didn't enjoy, and the poetry and literature that you were ambivalent towards. But of course, everyone will have different lists. Is there a particular critical approach, for instance, thinking about biographical information about the poet, or historical information about when the poem was written? To what extent do your own experiences and beliefs and values and assumptions inform your interpretation? And what kinds of evidence are you using from the poem to support your particular position? So I think of this as the beginning of the poetry section, that previously we've used some sample poems to examine. And probably one of the most famous poems ever written is Shakespearean sonnet, by the title of Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? Do note that none of Shakespeare's sonnets were titled, so we refer to the sonnets by their first line, or they've also been put in numerical order by scholars, so we could refer to it by its number as well, something that we'll talk about with Emily Dickinson. We think that Shakespeare wrote most of his sonnets during times of plague, during the English Renaissance, when the theaters would have been shut down for health reasons, so that he would probably be focused on his poetry. And the sonnet, as we had talked about a little bit earlier on in the semester when we were talking about A Sorrowful Woman, is a very highly structured and formalized poem. So it has quite a few rules in terms of length, in terms of its rhyme scheme or pattern, in terms of its meter and beat, even in terms of its theme and topic. That said, despite the fact that all of those rules had to be followed, Shakespeare found a way to be creative, and he wrote over 100 sonnets. So this gives us an idea of the kind of brilliance that Shakespeare had to be able to fit into that formula, yet still be creative at the same time. And scholars have tried to organize these poems into 2 groups, what they call the early set of sonnets and the later set of sonnets. And the early set of sonnets are thought to have mostly been written to one individual, a young man, perhaps the Earl of Southampton, someone that Shakespeare wanted to flatter, perhaps a patron. The later set of sonnets are written to someone known as the Dark Lady, and that most of those were written to a woman with dark hair and dark eyes. Think Hermia when we were talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, that said, many of the sonnets are so general that they could apply to any of a number of people. That's part of the power of Shakespearean sonnets, is that they could be utilized in a lot of different ways. And certainly the sonnets have been used to try to figure out Shakespeare's biography. As we had discussed, there's very little that's known about Shakespeare and its life. That's a dangerous game. Again, because the sonnets oftentimes will contradict one another, and that some of the sonnets would seem to suggest that the author is young and is reveling in youth. Other sonnets would seem to be that the author is old and is lamenting old age. So again, we have to think about the fictional and the creative element that is associated with the sonnets. And there are as many questions about the sonnets as there are about the dramas. But this particular sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, is listed in the earlier set of sonnets by scholars. Those sonnets written to a young man, which is very surprising to many people because they usually think of this sonnet as a romantic love sonnet. Usually they'll talk about that this was written to a woman. Notice when I read you this sonnet that we don't have any pronouns to indicate the gender of the person to whom this sonnet is written. I think that's one of the reasons why this sonnet is so powerful, is because it's so universal. That said, because this sonnet is thought to have been written to a young man, there have been questions about Shakespeare's sexuality. Could he have been homosexual or bisexual? And again, there is as much speculation about everything else in Shakespeare's life, such as his religion or his political affiliations, for instance. Usually, the way the sonnet is read is that this is not a sexual sonnet, but this is a sonnet of flattery, which would have been common during the time of the Renaissance, especially if you wanted to flatter somebody who had something that you wanted. And Shakespeare's patron would definitely have something that Shakespeare would want, the patron's political support and also the patron's financial support. So it makes a lot of sense that we would have a very complimentary, almost hyperbolic sonnet, an extreme exaggeration. But in terms of thinking about this particular sonnet for Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, the thought is that it was written around 1609, and I'll read this to you out loud. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance, or nature's changing course, untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. You'll notice the sonnet is 14 lines, and a Shakespearean or Renaissance sonnet is always 14 lines. You'll notice that it has a certain pattern or rhyme scheme, which is A, B, C, D, E, F, G, G. The last two lines rhyme together. That's known as a couplet. And if we were to test this, well, we would look at the last word of each line. So in this instance, if I started with the first line and I compared it to the third line, day and May rhyme together. And temperate, the second line, rhymes with the fourth line, date. That's our A, B. I should have a new rhyme that comes next in the fifth line, shines, which rhymes with declines. And dimmed rhymes with untrimmed. And that's our second set of rhymes. And then the last, fade should rhyme with shade, which it does. Owest should rhyme with growest, which it does. And then lastly, the couplet. And C should rhyme with thee. So it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And what we should also find is that it has a particular meter or beat. It should have a 10-syllable line. So if we take the first line, for instance, shall I compare thee to a summer's day. That's 10 syllables, stressed and unstressed. And in fact, we will see that through each line in all of the Shakespearean sonnets. And the sonnets have to be about lofty subjects that would be important enough to discuss in poetry. Things like love, beauty, aging. You certainly wouldn't want to talk about the common, the ordinary, or the mundane. And Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day is about love. So it makes perfect sense that we've got a sonnet here that follows all of the criteria of what we would assume for a sonnet. And it begins with the question, shall I compare thee, which means you, to a summer's day? And in other words, if we were going to paraphrase this poem and put it in our own words, basically what Shakespeare is saying is, should I compare you to a summer's day, and that this person is more lovely and more predictable, more temperate than summer. So the rest of the sonnet goes through and it talks about some of the negatives associated with summer, and saying that this person, however, shall live forever, unlike the summer, which is temporary, which of course is not possible. And this is where we get our last two lines. So long as men can breathe, their eyes can see. So long lives this, and this gives life to thee. And that's what is probably the most difficult part of the poem, is trying to understand that. But let's go through the poem from the beginning. Shall I compare thee, you, to a summer's day? Using the summer day as an example of the epitome of beauty. Summer is supposed to be the height of the natural cycle as well as the daytime. Thou, meaning you, art more lovely and more temperate. You're more beautiful and more predictable than a summer. And these are the reasons why. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. In other words, sometimes it can be windy in the summer. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. And that again, summer is temporary. I love the idea of the use lease. It's not something that we own. It's something that we use, and something that is lent to us, in effect. Sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines. Sometimes it's too hot outside in the summer. The sun is too hot. But rather than call it the sun, we've got the eye of heaven. But again, remember, we need to have enough words and enough syllables so that we can keep to the criteria of what a sonnet is. And often is his gold complexion dimmed. Sometimes it's cloudy, and therefore that blocks the sun. Notice how the sun is referred to as a his or a male, which is very common in literature, and that the moon would be female. And every fair from fair sometime declines. And in this instance, fair doesn't mean justice, it means beauty. So for instance, if you remember the fairy tale, Mirror, Mirror on the Wall, who's the fairest one of all, or who's the most beautiful one of all? That in other words, every beauty declines, either by chance or by nature's changing course on trim. So there could be an accident that takes away one's beauty, but aging will ultimately take away one's beauty. But thy, again meaning your, eternal summer shall not fade. So Shakespeare's basically saying this person has an eternal summer, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. And at least in your textbook, you're given a definition of owest, which means to possess. So in other words, this person will never lose their beauty, their fairness. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. In other words, you will never die. And of course, we know that that's not literally true. But notice how death is referred to as a he. Again, a very common idea that death is masculine. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. When in eternal lines to time thou growest. And in fact, that this person will continue to develop over time. So how can that be? So we get to our last two lines. Notice they're sectioned off that couplet. It almost serves as a kind of concluding paragraph in all of the sonnets. So long as men can breathe, their eyes can see. In other words, as long as there's somebody alive to read the sonnet, so long lives this. In other words, so long lives this sonnet. And this sonnet gives life to thee. But notice we aren't given this sonnet. We're only told this, which is a pronoun, which takes the place of a noun, but we're not given the noun. You might have gotten a comment about that in your first paper. Unclear pronoun reference, this, what, be concrete. Usually we use a pronoun to replace a noun, but if it's not clear in the sentence what noun is being replaced, it could be misunderstood. Though usually what ends up happening with writers is that they reference that noun in the previous sentence, but still each sentence should stand alone as an independent unit. Therefore, you want to try to add in that noun in that sentence before you start to use the pronoun, which takes the place of a noun. Of course, here Shakespeare is just giving us the pronoun without the noun, but he doesn't have to follow the rules of writing an academic paper because this is not an academic paper. It is a piece of literature. And of course, he has to keep to the rhyme and the meter, so he can't put in words superfluously because we've got to keep to the beat. So, if you weren't quite sure how to proceed with this poem, or the poems that are following, many of them have questions in the textbook afterwards that could give you some direction. So, for instance, you're asked to describe the shift in tone and subject matter that begins in line 9. So that gives you an idea that something changes in line 9. And this is where Shakespeare moves from talking about the negatives of summer to how this person surpasses them. Why is the speaker's loved one more lovely than a summer's day? What qualities does he admire in the loved one? And we've talked about many of the negatives associated with summer, where Shakespeare's suggesting those don't necessarily exist in this person. What does the couplet, or those last 2 lines, say about the relation between art and love? In other words, that art can immortalize. And we take that a step further, that means the artist can immortalize. Think about how grand of a statement this is, how arrogant it is, that basically the only thing that can give everlasting life is God. Oh, and Shakespeare, the poet. And perhaps he was right because we're still talking about this poem. So Shakespeare was not shy, as we know when we read A Midsummer Night's Dream. He was arrogant, but he also was rightly arrogant. So perhaps he didn't need to be humble. And then asking about the stressed and unstressed in the actual lines themselves. So that just gives you an idea of a sonnet. There are many different kinds of sonnets. If you're reading the textbook that I had assigned for class, there's another sonnet from Shakespeare that starts with, "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun." We believe that sonnet was written in the later set of sonnets written to the Dark Lady. And mistress would have meant a woman. It didn't have the negative connotations that it does today. And this sonnet is the exact opposite of "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" where Shakespeare goes through the entire sonnet talking about all of the flaws that this person, this woman, has, but that he still loves this woman. It almost reminds me of what we were talking about with the magic of love as compared to love poem, and that love poem, when we were reading that particular piece and talking about my clumsiest dear, what we ended up getting was, yes, some negatives associated with this person, but it seemed that it was much more realistic than what we were talking about with the magic of love, with the wonderful magic of love, with its sing-song quality and its cliches and its generalities. So we move on from Shakespeare, and I wanted to give you another poem, and this poem is entitled "To His Coy Mistress." And this particular poem is known, and you can see this in the notes below, as a metaphysical poem. So it's a kind of writing style. I just talked a little bit about a sonnet. That's a kind of writing style. The metaphysical poem is another kind of writing style. Oftentimes you use extreme and exaggerated images. The goal is to be as witty as possible and as shocking as possible. This was written in 1681, just to give you an idea of where we are in terms of time. And this would be in England. And this particular poem is also known as a carpe diem poem, which means to seize the day. In other words, to live now because you aren't guaranteed of a future. It also is a poem that pushes boundaries, as you will see, as metaphysical poems oftentimes do. This poem in particular is known for how it pushes boundaries, and it's presented in a 3-part argument. In some ways, it's quite academic. It's an attempt to woo a woman. So, the poem, which I'll read to you, "To His Coy Mistress," again, mistress is a woman, didn't necessarily have the negative connotations that mistress has today. Coy means somebody who's shy. "Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk, and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side should rubies find. I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires, and more slow. And 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze. 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. An age at least to every part, and the last age to show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at a lower rate. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing sound. Then worms shall try that long-preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour, than languish in his slow chapped power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. And if we were to go through and paraphrase this poem, this 3-part poem, because there's slight indentations, they're not necessarily divided up into stanzas in the way some poems are, which are almost like paragraph breaks, but we've got a slight indentation. So the first piece of the 3-part poem is, if we had time, this is what we would do. Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness or this shyness lately were no crime. They'd sit down and think which way to walk. They could spend hours contemplating where to take a walk, when to take a walk, and pass the day that way, and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side should rubies find. And at least in my text, we're given a definition that the Ganges is a river in India, sacred to the Hindus. So they could go to India looking for rubies, or she could at least, and I by the tide of Humber would complain. In other words, that he could stay in England and wait for her. Humber, it happens to be a river that flows there. I would love you 10 years before the flood. Flood is capitalized. We're talking about the biblical flood of Noah and his ark. In other words, she's talking about long previous times in history. And you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. So now this is the other extreme into the future. When will it be that the Jews will convert? And the answer probably is never. It certainly hasn't happened yet. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. Think about the phallic possibilities of vegetables, a cucumber, for instance, and that growing slowly. And 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze. He'd spend 100 years just praising her eyes. 200 to adore each breast. He'd spend 200 years adoring each of her breasts. That's 400 total. And 30,000 to the rest. 30,000 years basically paying homage to her entire body. An age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at a lower rate. In other words, you deserve to have basically eternity spent with my wooing you. But, there's always a but. This is the second part of the argument. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. In other words, time's a wasting. You might hear it in the poem as I was reading it, is that the language speeds up as well. And yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity, though you could pronounce it eternity if you wanted to keep to that particular rhyme. And that basically eventually we will all die. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. When we die, you'll no longer be beautiful, and you will be buried in a marble vault, where you can't hear my praising. And then the shocking part, because again, metaphysical poetry tries to be witty. Then worms shall try that long preserved virginity. So if this woman maintains her virginity and doesn't give it to him, eventually her virginity will be stolen by worms, another phallic symbol, when she's a corpse in the ground. And your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fine and private place, but none I think do there embrace. So in other words, it's almost like a threat. It's if she doesn't give up her virginity to him, then basically the worms will take it when she is dead. And she won't be able to appreciate the pleasures of the flesh. So this is the third part of the argument. Now, so this is about living in the moment. Therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, in other words, while you're young, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, when you're filled with passion and desire, which happens in youth. Now let us sport us while we may. In other words, let's play. But I love the idea of sport because I don't think you're supposed to take this kind of poetry very seriously. It's with a wink and a nod because it is so absurd trying to woo a woman through the suggestion of worms, basically taking her virginity in death. Now let us sport us while we may, and now like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in a slow chat power. You've got the option of either devouring time, taking advantage of every moment. I think we call it living your best life in our current time, as opposed to letting time devour you. Let us roll our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball. You know, the idea, let's unite into one, and which is what happens during sexual coupling. And tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. And we usually talk about the golden gates of heaven, but now we're talking about the iron gates of life, that we can make this as much of a paradise as heaven. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, we can't stop time. Yet we will make him run. Or if you've heard the expression, give him a run for his money. But this is also another wink and a nod because there was another metaphysical poet at the time who was quite popular, and his name was John Donne. And he wrote a poem, The Sun Also Rising, and it's about a lover lamenting the fact that the evening is going to be gone as the sun is rising so that he can no longer be amorously with his lover. Again, another Carpe Diem poem. Let's take advantage of this moment. But of course, anybody who knows metaphysical poetry knows that this is a reference to John Donne and the sun. So I wanted you to get an example of metaphysical poetry, just like I wanted to give you an example of a sonnet. I'm just kind of selecting different examples of poetry. And of course, this can't in any way be a kind of comprehensive review of poetry. The questions at the end also give you some direction. Do you think this Carpe Diem poem is hopelessly dated, or does it speak to our contemporary concerns? And then we're told in the second question, the poem is divided into a three-part argument. Summarize each section, lines 1 through 20, lines 21 through 32, and lines 33 to 46. What is the speaker's tone? How much time would he spend adoring his mistress? Is he sincere? Again, this exaggeration is an impossibility. How does he expect his mistress to respond? How does the speaker's tone change beginning with line 21? So this gives you an idea that the tone does change, where it says that basically time is short. What is his view of time, and does this description, what does this description do to the lush and leisurely sense of time in the first part of the poem, where he spent eternity adoring her? In the final lines, what do you think the poet is suggesting? And this poem is sometimes read as a vigorous but simple celebration of the flesh. Is there more to the theme than that? And they even ask you to compare it to another poem that we're not reading, to the Virgins, to make much of time. Very similar idea. It's live now within the moment. And again, notice this very male-centric idea of female relinquishing virginity, something that we had talked about in A Midsummer Night's Dream as well. But next class, we'll talk about some other poetry, including a poem, the author to her book, also written in the 1600s, but this time by a female poet. Not that it was necessarily that unusual for a female to be writing, but for a female to be published was quite the trick. So I wanted to give that as a kind of balance, as well as a poem by William Blake, known as one of the Romantic poets. We'll talk about what the Romantic poets would oftentimes discuss. It wasn't necessarily just about romance per se, even though they're called Romantic poets. Because I could not stop for death, I wanted us to have a sample of something from Miss Emily Dickinson, being from Amherst, and a poem called American Poetry by Louis Simpson that I suspect you probably haven't written before, but I think it serves as a nice transition for not only moving from British poetry to American poetry, but also moving to poetry from the 16, 17, 1800s to the 1900s. And I think we see poems that are much more raw and much more in opposition of some of the established forms that were created in the centuries beforehand. So again, your attendance question, which will be due on Thursday for our class by noon. What drama are you thinking about writing paper number 2 about, and why? What paper are you thinking about writing paper number 2 about, and why? So it'll be due Thursday the 8th. Ideally, you would hand in your paper Thursday the 8th by 11:59 p.m. to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. But you have up until the 15th, but not beyond the 15th, to be able to submit that, as well as your journal for the 3 poems. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.